Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror and bourbon fan Eric Malachite, and speaking of bourbon, we'll be talking about something I've been wanting to do for a long time, the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. Its history, the myths associated with what my spirit animal, Ron Swanson, calls the nectar of the gods, and more. Today's script was written by Larry Holsworth, and if Larry has provided us with his socials, they'll be linked right alongside my own. With that said, let's get to it. The Kentucky Bourbon Trail is a program designed to promote and celebrate bourbon whiskey, itself designated by Congress in 1964 as a distinctive product of the United States. Bourbon was born in the bluegrass region of Kentucky, likely in the late 18th century, though there are nearly as many legends and myths regarding its discovery as there are blades of bluegrass in Kentucky. Bluegrass, by the way, is native to Europe, not Kentucky, and was likely introduced to the region in the 17th century. Bourbon is native to Kentucky, likely created by Scots settlers, its name coming from the dynastic family of the French monarchs in a roundabout manner. The Kentucky Bourbon Trail came into being in 1999, a product of the Kentucky Distillers Association, or KDA. It consists of member distilleries, which are listed as stops on the trail, though not all of the distilleries support tours. There are 4 gateway regions designated for the trail. These are Northern Kentucky, Lexington, Louisville, and Bardstown. The 18 stops of the main Bourbon Trail are scattered around these 4 gateways. There is also a craft tour, also divided into 4 regions, with a total of 28 stops. The craft tour is focused on the continuing re-emergence of craft bourbons in the United States. Tours for the Bourbon Trail are not guided, as individuals independently select which distilleries they would like to visit, though the tours within those distilleries usually are accompanied. The trail is designed to enhance the myths and legends surrounding what has been called America's true spirit, and to celebrate bourbon's rich history in America as well as Kentucky's. Along with the distilleries and craft bars that comprise the trail, other slices of American history are nearby. Louisville offers a Louisville Slugger Museum and Factory dedicated to the American pastime of baseball. Hot dogs. It also offers the Muhammad Ali Museum and Home, celebrating Louisville's most famous son. Bardstown is the site of the original Old Kentucky home, immortalized in song by Stephen Foster in the 19th century. Foster was also the writer of such Americana as Oh Susanna, Camptown Races, Swanee River, and Beautiful Dreamer. And I can't be the only one who thinks of Blazing Saddles every time he hears Camptown Races. Foster also famously dreamed of Jenny with the light brown hair. Outside Lexington, visitors can find the Kentucky Horse Park, dedicated to the support and celebration of another of Kentucky's signature industries, horse racing. Near the Northern Kentucky Gateway is Cincinnati, which offers Major League Sports, the Underground Railroad Museum, an internationally acclaimed zoo, and other diversions year-round. Yet, the main focus of the Bourbon Trail is unsurprisingly bourbon whiskey, how it is made, how it compares to other spirits, i.e. it's better, and how it tastes. The story of bourbon is in many ways the story of the trail. So to begin at the start of the trail is to begin, so to speak, with the beginning of bourbon. By the way, in the comments, tell me what your favorite bourbon is, because right now mine is Stag. I love Stag. It's not for the faint of heart, because I love spicy food. I love ghost pepper. So this spicier whiskey just, it does it for me, you know? It's great. You should try it. There are so many myths, legends, arguments, false claims, and disputes over the origin of bourbon, how it got its name, who developed the process of distilling it, barreling it, aging it, and even naming it, that they will never be settled satisfactorily. Nor should they be. The disputes are part of the fun. Some distillers call their product bourbon whiskey with a letter E in the name. Others, including Maker's Mark, which is super mid in my humble opinion, one of the most well-known brands nationwide, omits the E, calling their product bourbon whiskey. It seems a small thing, but it is indicative of the tenacity of the opinions held by some regarding the fruit of their labors. As strange as it may seem, the American Congress has resolved some of the more basic issues regarding bourbon. In order to be sold as bourbon in the United States, it must be made in the United States. It must be distilled from a mash consisting of at least 51% corn. Other spirits can be and are added, but they must be added to what is 51% or better corn liquor. It must be aged in charred white oak barrels which have not been used before, hence they are referred to as virgin oak. Distilling likely arrived in Kentucky with the earliest Scots settlers in the late 18th century. Several grains were available from which to distill spirits, including rye, wheat, maize, and corn. Corn was particularly suited to distilling since it did not ship well. In bourbon lore, as early Kentucky settlers and Baptist minister named Elijah Craig is often credited with being the creator of the earliest bourbon-style whiskey, using corn limestone spring water and aging the resulting spirit in oak barrels. Elijah Craig is still around today, and you can buy it at your local liquor store, or in my case, an ABC store. The tale is likely mythical. Craig did operate a distillery beginning in about 1789. He likely used a predominantly corn mash. Whether he aged the spirit in oak barrels at all, let alone charred oak barrels, is highly dubious. His distillery was also not located in Bourbon County, which some promote as the source of the name. Craig's distillery was located in the adjacent Fayette County. Another claimant to the honor of being the inventor of bourbon was Evan Williams. Williams went to America from Wales, eventually settling in Kentucky near modern-day Louisville, and established his distillery there along the Ohio River in 1783. Today, Evan Williams, one of the world's largest selling bourbons, claims on its bottle labels to be Kentucky's first bourbon, with a date of 1783. Yet historical records have Mr. Williams arriving in the United States in 1794 in Philadelphia. Scandal. Such is the case with nearly all of the claims to be first. Another problem is the name itself. Most link it to Bourbon County, Kentucky, which was named either in honor of the French king who aided America in its War of Independence, or of the Marquis de Lafayette, for whom Fayette County, Kentucky, was named. Lafayette was a distant relative and thus member of the royal house of France, whose titular name was Bourbon. Another theory, which gained prominence in the 20th century, is that the name came from Bourbon Street in New Orleans, where many early distillers shipped their product for sale. The barrels were marked with their destination, the warehouses on Bourbon Street. It's also possible that the aging in oak began as whiskey was barreled for shipping. Another tale heard along the Bourbon Trail is that of Jacob Boehme, a German immigrant who settled in Kentucky near Bardstown in the late 18th century. There he changed the spelling of his last name to Beam, which should be very familiar to you. He began selling a corn whiskey in 1795 marketed as Old Jake Beam Sour Mash, who invented the sour mash process, in which a portion of a spent mash is reserved to use as a starter in the next batch, is also a bone of contention among Kentucky distillers. At any rate, Jake Beam was the predecessor to today's Jim Beam, but only after many years and many near disasters, including the national tragedy or noble experiment of Prohibition, depending on one's point of view. Visitors who stop at some of the many available distilleries along the Bourbon Trail will become acquainted with these and countless additional stories of how bourbon whiskey came to be. Another frequently recounted possibility is that corn liquor came to be called bourbon to differentiate it from whiskey made primarily of wheat and rye, which was often called Fayette whiskey or simply rye whiskey. It seems as strong a possibility as any other. Kentucky was a border state during the Civil War, and the bluegrass region, which spans north-central Kentucky, was roiled with internal conflicts. About half of the state's population favored the South. A like number held northern views. These views developed in the years known as the antebellum era, and were reflected in all walks of life, including dress, speech, manners, and choice of spirits. In the pre-Civil War years, bourbon became a beverage associated with Southern manners and Southern hospitality. The mint julep, a concoction of ice, water, sugar, fresh mint leaves, and bourbon, was popular among the Southern gentry. I personally prefer my whiskey neat. Although it likely originated elsewhere, Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky first brought the drink to Washington, D.C. at the Willard colored hotel, where it became a symbol of Southern hospitality. Henry Clay was known as the Great Compromiser. Whether bourbon-fueled juleps helped him sell his compromises to his colleagues is unknown. It certainly seems possible, though. Yet bourbon remained a drink identified with the South, while the drier and lighter rye whiskey achieved greater popularity north and west of the Ohio River. One of many traits shared between officers of both the eventual Confederate and Union armies during the antebellum era was a taste for bourbon. This likely resulted from so many being stationed in the South, in coastal forts and in Texas. Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman, James Longstreet, John Bell Hood, Albert Sidney Johnston, and many others enjoyed a glass or two or three of bourbon when the occasion called for it, that occasion being every occasion in my house. Union General Joseph Hooker was so fond of the stuff that he frequently experienced trouble trying to sit his horse. More recent scholarship indicates that Hooker actually consumed relatively little when he drank. He simply had a low tolerance for alcohol. The Civil War myth regarding bourbon whiskey and General Grant is apocryphal. According to the story, when Lincoln was informed of General Grant's being frequently drunk on bourbon, he told his aides to send Grant a barrel, a nod to the Union commander's fighting spirit. There is no record of such an event, though Lincoln himself, a teetotaler, which means to abstain entirely from alcohol, recognized the role whiskey played in the morale of troops. Troops marching through the South during the Civil War found stashes of bourbon and in many cases raw corn liquor, meaning it had not been aged in charred barrels. It was closer to moonshine than finished whiskey, but the sweetness of the corn appealed to many, a tastier alternative to the dry rye whiskey of their homelands. Don't let them. You don't have to take that. No, everyone loves you. Following the Civil War, bourbon grew in popularity in the North. Kentucky Distilleries, with relative easy access to the Ohio River and its tributaries, grew as they shipped whiskey to northern cities. The label Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey became a point of pride and a sign of quality. Straight bourbon meant the whiskey was 100% bourbon, as opposed to blended bourbon, which contains other spirits besides that extracted from corn. Yet even blended bourbon must, under federal law, consist of at least 51% corn as its base. Prior to government intervention, the label was no guarantee that the whiskey contained therein was from Kentucky, constituted bourbon, or was even whiskey. Less honest distillers shipped spirits in barrels, particularly to the West, where unscrupulous purveyors bottled it and slapped whatever label was handy on the bottle. The selling of labels became nearly as profitable as selling the liquor itself. There was, for a time, no standard defining what could be labeled as Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. In 1870, the first bourbon sold only in bottles was introduced, appearing in the market under the brand name Old Forester. It immediately became known as a premium whiskey since it was more expensive than most available brands. However, most of the increase in price came from the expense of the bottles. Bottles were still hand-blown, making them both expensive and relatively scarce. In the 1800s, methods for mass-producing glass bottles by taking advantage of the benefits of steam power emerged, and whiskey bottled at the distillery, formerly scarce, became far more common. So did the emergence of whiskeys labeled as bourbon, but were actually little more than neutral grain spirits treated with flavoring agents and food coloring. They became known as rectified bourbon, a polite term referring to fake bourbon, yet no law prevented their purveyors from plying their trade. Rectified bourbons became so common that distillers of real bourbon turned to the federal government for aid. The result was the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897. Bottled in bond did not make rectified bourbons illegal, but it allowed the purveyors of real bourbon to so label their product, assuring the consumer that the quality of the beverage was certified by the US government. The turn of the 20th century saw a push for increased surveillance of all products intended to be ingested by humans, including meats, dairy products, patent medicines, and alcoholic beverages. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 addressed what could and could not be identified as bourbon whiskey. On December 29, 1909, President William Howard Taft further addressed the issue, when by executive order the categories of whiskeys, which still exist today, were established as straight, blended, and imitation. Then came Prohibition. Legal distillation of bourbon came to a standstill. A very few were allowed to continue to produce bourbon, sold to doctors to be used as prescription medicine. Yeah, Medicine. I wonder if people used back pain as an excuse to be prescribed bourbon back then. As is well known, moonshiners continued to produce illegal whiskey. Americans who could afford it turned to smugglers for their whiskey, obtaining it from sources in Canada, Ireland, and Scotland, among others. The Prohibition era changed American taste for whiskey, with rye becoming almost extinct and bourbon not far behind. Americans learned to enjoy Canadian blended whiskey made mostly from wheat, and Scotch and Irish whiskeys made mostly from barley and flavored by the peat fires over which their mash was cooked. By the end of Prohibition in 1933, there was little taste in America for the spirit that had been born there. Legally produced and sold bourbon returned to America in 1933 just as the Great Depression ensured few could afford it. Bourbon sales lagged in the 1930s and through World War II, when alcohol was rationed by the federal government. In the post-war years, bourbon sales continued to suffer. Tastes had changed. In the late 1940s and through the 1950s and 1960s, alcohol consumption increased in America, but how it was consumed had shifted with consumer taste. Scotch whiskey, spelled with an E by the parsimonious Scots, was the preferred quaff of middle and upper class consumers. The emergence of a new American social event, the cocktail party, led to the popularity of drinks mixed with white liquors, including gin and vodka. The latter had been virtually unknown in the United States before World War II. In the 1960s, its popularity soared, fueled in part by the James Bond craze. Americans preferred the more mixable whiskeys, such as the blended Canadian whiskeys of their American counterparts, in their mixed drinks. A concoction made with Seagram's 7 Crown whiskey, an American blended whiskey, and 7-Up, a lemon-lime soda, became known as the 7 and 7, and was wildly popular during the period. I almost said 7-Up yours. Who remembers that commercial? Vodka, martinis, and gin and tonics were also popular, easy to make at home or order when outside the home. Bourbon bottles largely and somewhat sadly gathered dust. In the 1970s, another whiskey made in Tennessee and filtered through charcoal after distilling became the most popular drink for those desiring their American whiskey straight. Jack Daniel's gross boom in popularity came at the expense of bourbon, and was itself boosted by Frank Sinatra as his personal favorite libation. Bourbon sales in America remained steady, and there was enough of a market overseas for the bourbon distillers to remain solvent, but by the 1980s it was widely regarded with disdain by whiskey connoisseurs. From the end of Prohibition until 1984, bourbon in the bottle was the result of the distillers master blending the contents of 2 or more barrels of aged bourbon until a satisfactory presentation of color and taste was achieved. All bottled bourbons were thus blends of several different batches of bourbon. In 1984, the first single-barrel bourbon since Prohibition was introduced by Blanton's Distillery. By the end of the decade, several more had been produced, all proudly claiming to have been bottled from a single barrel. The emphasis on single barrels and small batches conveyed the message of craftsmanship and quality. Slowly at first, but with increasing tempo each succeeding year, bourbon sales increased. The number of distillers producing top-shelf bourbons increased as well, and the beverage's image improved along with its sales. In 1996, the bourbon industry suffered its worst disaster since the onset of Prohibition. In November of that year, a fire began in a single aging warehouse at the Haven Hill Distillery in Bardstown, Kentucky. It quickly became apparent to the firefighters that the water with which they attempted to extinguish the flames was no match for burning oak barrels filled with bourbon. Burning liquid flowed from the first warehouse, eventually igniting 7 more. All were completely destroyed. So were abandoned firefighting equipment, other vehicles, and virtually everything else in the path of the flames. The fire was eventually controlled the next day, but not before it consumed almost 100,000 barrels of bourbon. In just one night, the fire reduced the world's stock of whiskey by 2%. There were no injuries to any people reported as a result of the fire, though many bourbon lovers were no doubt deeply troubled by the sad news. The Kentucky Bourbon Trail crisscrosses the area known as the bluegrass region. The grass itself is usually called Kentucky bluegrass and is common throughout the meadows and farmlands of central Kentucky. It is not indigenous to the United States, nor is it blue or even bluish-green in color. In some areas of the United States and in Canada, it is considered an invasive species. It came to the Americas courtesy of the Spanish explorers and conquistadors. It is a highly durable grass used by several professional football teams and numerous Major League Baseball teams as their playing surfaces. How it arrived in Kentucky is anybody's guess, though most attribute its traveling with other grass seeds, including ryegrass brought by the early European settlers in the region. The Kentucky bluegrass region is located in the northern and central portion of the state, west of the Appalachians, and has been steadily shrinking as urban and suburban areas encroach upon it, converting the land to other uses. The region shares its name with a form of music, but it is not the source of the name for bluegrass music. That usage came from an early performer of the style, Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys, who did hail from Kentucky. It would be an intrepid soul indeed who attempted to travel the entire Bourbon Trail in one continuous journey, especially if the explorers sampled the products of each stop on the trail. Why would you take the trail if you weren't going to sample everything on it? Of course, the main product is bourbon whiskey, though the trail also features other products which use bourbon. Bourbon cookies, bourbon cakes, and bourbon candies are available everywhere along the trail. So are fruits packed in jars filled with bourbon. This sounds like my kind of candy. There are bourbon-flavored barbecue sauces, sauces for ice cream and ice cream made with bourbon, bourbon fudge, and many other concoctions using the whiskey. And even my beard oil is made from bourbon. I love bourbon. When visiting the trail, or any of the trail's 4 gateways, there are many other activities within reach. Should one need a break from the smell of distilling corn, the Northern Gateway offers several distilleries, all with tours and all within easy driving range of each other. It also offers Big Bone Lick State Park, the site of the first vertebra paleontological dig in the United States. Fossils discovered and recovered from the site have been dated to the Pleistocene epoch, 2.5 million years to approximately 20,000 years ago. Just a short drive from the park, a visitor may tour the Creation Museum, which presents evidence claiming the Earth is approximately 6,000 years old. It displays dioramas in which ancient humans, presumably descendants from Adam, happily coexist with dinosaurs. After being presented with such conflicting facts, one may understandably desire to return to the Bourbon Trail to mull over what one's learned by drinking the wares. And no, humans never lived with dinosaurs. The Earth is not 6,000 years old. Don't even get me started on that. This video is too long already for that nonsense. The Louisville Gateway is the site of the Fraser History Museum, which houses the Kentucky Bourbon Trail Welcome Center. It also houses exhibitions on a changing basis, as well as a permanent collection of Americana. Nearby, the Bardstown region is the home of Haven Hill Distilleries, the site of the disastrous 1996 fire. It is also the home of Evan Williams, the best-selling bourbon in the world. Other bourbon makers claim to hold that title, but they do so by claiming the sales of several different products to support their claim. Yet, that's part of the bourbon tradition, claims of which is the oldest distillery, who invented the process, who made the first bourbon, who named it bourbon, and why, which sells the best, and so on and so forth, will not be definitively answered by traveling the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. Instead, the traveler will be presented with a dizzying array of conflicting information, exaggerated claims, and local mythology. The disputes aren't limited to whiskey either. A trip along the trail reveals the differences over the best basketball tradition, a sport discussed with near religious fervor in Kentucky. One finds there are scores of sites which are the home of the best bluegrass music, the best racehorse of all time, the purest limestone springs, and of course, the best bourbon in the land. Visiting the Kentucky Bourbon Trail is about much more than just bourbon whiskey. Its history, its present, and its future. Ultimately, it will likely change one's perception of bourbon and the people who make it, sell it, and enjoy it. There is a lot of spirit in Kentucky bourbon, and not just in terms of the alcohol it contains. Lewis Grizzard, a Southern writer, lecturer, and humorist, had this to say on the subject. The only way I could figure they could improve upon Coca-Cola, one of life's most delightful elixirs which studies prove will heal the sick and occasionally raise the dead, is to put bourbon in it. The multitude of distilleries which comprise the Kentucky Bourbon Trail and the hundreds of other sites which surround it, as well as those who support it, are likely to agree. Well, I hope you found this video to be both entertaining and informative. I know I've been wanting to do the Bourbon Trail for a while, and this has given me more reasons to actually get up off my butt and do it. And if you dug this content, be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz. Tell me what your favorite bourbon is down in the comments. And yeah, I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy. Finger guns.